Welcome everybody to another episode of Architect Tomorrow. Today we're going to talk about ecosystems and emerging technologies and why they complement one another and why we should be focusing on them now. And to do so, we've got a great panel again today. And what I'll do is I'll get everybody to introduce themselves first. So Gaia, if we begin with yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Gaia. I worked with many different architecture practices like systems, enterprise, software, you name it. And for the last 5 years, I'm not called anymore an architect, but it's mostly with architecture groups embedded in them or with them I'm working with. And what I focus on is creating the next for businesses, organizations, focusing on adoption. So that's my measure. And also mostly 99% of the time with emerging technologies.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for joining us again, Guy. And over to you, Sally, who's joining us for the first time.
Hi, thanks for including me in this forum. I'd like to declare I'm not an architect, but what I would say I'm an open innovation practitioner, so I bring together people, process and technology. I'm currently in a consumer brand after years in a consulting organisation, and what I've learned is the best way to innovate is bringing people together, and that's why I'm excited today to talk about ecosystems.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Sally. And over to Chris, who's joining us from the US, so we're really appreciative of you joining us so early in the morning.
Well, I appreciate you shifting the time a little bit so I could join. My name is Chris Lockhart. I'm a management consultant in the United States, and I've been an enterprise architect by trade for, almost 20 years now. And I focus largely on FS, financial services, health type industries, and addressing some of the same problems that both Sally and Guy have brought up, right? How do you connect business problems with technology enablers and solutions? And of course, there's always that piece in there about the people that are always tricky to deal with as well. So that's what I've been mostly focused on.
Sure, brilliant. Okay, excellent. So that's our panel. And then if I hand over to our mainstay, our own Chief IT Architect, Oliver Kronk, if you could introduce yourself again for anybody who's not seen the channel, and then just a little bit about what we're talking about today as well, ecosystems.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, Chief IT Architect at Tanium. Prior to Tanium, I've had a diverse career in IT and architecture roles, and spent a few years at a consultancy as well. And that's how I met Sally. So yeah, the context around this one. So for those of you who've been following the series, those who haven't, go check out the previous editions. But what we've been talking about is now being a difficult time for many organisations where they're either in a crunch point where there's a lack of demand, or a crunch point where actually there's a high amount of demand for their services. And so one of the things that we naturally led out of the conversations we've been having is, what does this mean for emerging technologies and ecosystems? And obviously we'll build on this more, but the sorts of things we're thinking about here are, does this mean you need to start to rethink about your value chain and who you do business with, who's in your wider ecosystem of suppliers or perhaps collaborating organizations? And also emerging technologies is now the time to be thinking about how you can leverage new ways to deliver value to your businesses. We talked on previous editions about digital channels and so on, which is more obvious examples of this, which perhaps previously, a decade ago, you would have called mobile apps an emerging technology. Of course, you wouldn't call that now. But is this now an opportunity to start, thinking about crowdsourcing, about other things that perhaps have been in your innovation incubator, but now is the time for them to shine? So, so at Tanium, I very much think about our ecosystem being, the other vendors we work alongside, so the large technology vendors, but of course our customers, but also the regulators and the standards bodies as well. How do we influence and work with those organizations to make sure that what we're building as a product aligns with the expectation in the market and from other stakeholders? So particularly the regulatory angle. I think often people think of the regulator as the big scary kind of policeman. Actually, I think a far more collaborative approach with the regulator and standards bodies is the right answer. And so my view of ecosystem architecture, in fact, I blogged about this in 2015, talked about enterprise architecture shifting to more of an ecosystem view, where you think beyond your castle and moat of an organization and start thinking about who you're collaborating with. So I think this, I look forward to kind of talking about this more, and I think, yeah, this hopefully will be another exciting discussion. Over to you, Guy, because I know this is a particular passion of yours, isn't it?
It's very much so. Like, Oliver, when you mentioned, like, I think it's a couple of weeks right now, I was like definitely excited because I feel deeply this is the exact focus that we should have: ecosystems, emerging technologies. But I had this doubt at the same time, that thinking, am I being luxurious? Because we have been doing it for some time when it's like business as usual, creating change. And I was thinking, am I being tone deaf? Like, feeling that is the most important, one of the most important things that we should be thinking and discussing about. But I'm excited, like you saw the same need. And more I feel it's exactly what we should be addressing. Because before, like, I've worked always in the white space, I call it, where there's risk, where it's like unpredictability, and you're trying to create the next that will be relevant for the business and organization. And it feels like that white space is only a little bit bigger than what it has been, and it included other people as well, other parts of the business that are usual, which are like not that usual. And the experiences, the lenses that we have adopted to create next is very applicable, I think, at the moment. So I'm excited that we will be addressing and talking about this today.
And I know one of the other things that I'm keen to learn from you is your experience of DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, and perhaps what large enterprises or medium-sized organizations can learn from those sorts of organizations. But yeah, thank you, Guy.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for bringing the topic to Architect Tomorrow. And I think it's a really relevant topic for us to be talking about right now. And the first major question we're looking to answer is why do they complement one another so well, the ecosystems and the emerging technologies that help us to work within these ecosystems. And so, to begin with, given our current climate, why don't we explore a little bit how the ecosystems surrounding businesses right now are bringing new opportunities to businesses and new revenue streams during COVID-19? Who would like to kick us off with this one?
Well, I can start with just a really simple high street example. I know our lens is emerging tech, but I think for businesses that are trying to survive, that have been massively impacted by this global health situation, are those that depend on interactions, and that's your restaurants and your high street. And basically, I'm sure they're not, looking at it from an MBA and innovation perspective, but they're opening up their supply chain direct to their consumers by, enabling Google Doc forms so customers can order. That's just a pure survival perspective. So I would welcome huge enterprises that have so much more resources in terms of capital, people, and emerging technology to take that same survival mandate and think, what do we have in our treasure trove of capabilities within our organization that we can use differently to serve our customers through this difficult time?
That's actually interesting. I'll pick up that thread, because I think, if you think of an ecosystem and you think of, the pieces that go into that, right? You have your producers, you have your customers, and you have sort of your stakeholders, in between there. And I think large companies, Sally, I think, you'd like to think they have all of these resources and all of these capabilities so they can solve all of these problems. And I think there are cases like that during the current crisis, but I think there's a lot of other cases of companies that are so confused as to what they're supposed to be doing, in part because of those three things. The consumers have dramatically changed their behavior in a very short period of time. And so you have a structure of the stakeholders, right, and the producers sitting there sort of holding the bag. One example might be, very recently here in the United States, the meat producers, poultry, pork, et cetera, are going to have to slaughter tens of millions of animals, primarily because the logistics systems have been taxed, so product cannot get where it needs to go. Consumer behavior has changed dramatically. And so the things that they were geared to do previously have sort of been interrupted very, very quickly. And so there's an example of, a company or an industry that, may not have the greatest of margins, should be fairly dynamic and flexible, but is actually caught almost unprepared, right, for this type of event. So, I'd like to think that, big companies like financial services or things like that would have it better. My experience so far over the past month would indicate otherwise.
It's almost like there's a shock, isn't there, to the supply chain and the supply and demand sort of side of things that needs to be recognized and then reflected in the ecosystem thinking of an organization or an enterprise.
You think about the producers, right? And the pork examples maybe too close to a producer, but I'm thinking a company that does financial services or a bank, right? And what they're used to doing and the customer behavior that they're used to servicing, which is no longer there or has changed. Many companies have spent the past decade undergoing digital transformations, right, to enable modern ways of interacting with their customer, and their customer has now just radically altered their behavior and may or may not be operating in the same way. Well, I mean, one example that I think maybe a digital transformation type of activity that has helped is in the space of delivery service, right? And so here's a case where traditional restaurants and restaurateurs may have felt like the proper experience to eat is in the restaurant. We're not going to deliver food. And of course now, right, if you don't deliver food, you're out of business if you're a restaurant. And so, those companies that invested in those capabilities had a leg up and were able to pivot fairly rapidly into a new business model. Those that did not invest are struggling to catch up.
How about when we're looking at the branding element, the brand equity of large organizations and negative PR could have an effect on how they're trying to make moves within their ecosystems and with their business? How does that affect what they're doing?
I had an interesting stat that whatever brands do today in this period is 15 years worth of marketing. If you think about the marketing budgets of the global brands, that's a lot of investment. I think brands want to do the right thing, but incredibly nervous for taking a misstep. For an insurance example, I don't know whether you see, but Admiral has rebated £25 to all of their customers because claims have reduced significantly. That's a very bold move for a very risk-averse industry. However, what's the lifetime of that loyalty? I think that's interesting. Will those customers still go on the price comparison website at the time of renewal and forget about the £25? But yeah, I think it's something that chief marketing officers and brand owners are really agonizing about, because we've seen some quite bad fallout. For like Virgin, he was just doing what every other big business was doing in terms of taking the government support. But, the government, the consumers have been quite eagle-eyed about how brands are behaving, and quite rightly so.
Yeah, that's a brilliant example. And Sally, I think you actually brought up about a lot of organisations. It's almost like people are taking a fight or flight type of model. It's as you said, Admiral, they're very much being bold to serve the market and to help extend their brand equity. But some organisations are doing the opposite, almost putting their head in the sand. And do you think that's potentially because of regulations on sort of financial services organisations? Or
regulation is there to stabilise markets, and actually nothing's stable at the moment. We need some flex. I was actually listening to some content from the US about the gig economy, and it's very regulated between what is an employee and what is an independent contractor, because there's no safety net, sorry Chris, around social care, and what can companies do to provide portable benefits. So actually I think we need some innovation in regulation, or some flex and breathability, so businesses can respond and support people. But definitely organisations that I'm seeing at the moment are very much operating on a defence perspective. So it's all about sustaining the operations, getting everyone working from home. Can we still do our core activities? And if you're regulated, those are the most important, because you cannot let that quality diminish.
I have a question I'll throw to basically any of you that want to answer this. Are you seeing the same sort of, we talk about regulated markets and industries, and certainly a lot of that is going on this side of the Atlantic as well. But are you also seeing sort of the other side? Are you seeing in the UK or in parts of Europe that bottom-up sort of response from companies in addressing needs in the market as a result of the virus?
Guy, I thought you had a good example of that when you were talking to me about this the other day.
Oh, bottom-up change definitely is like ecosystems enable that. Like you're much more with decentralization as well. You're looking at like more relevant ideas, more localized ideas that can be funded, that can be taken on board. It definitely enables that, and I think that's a very relevant aspect to bring about. So what I'm seeing at the moment in what I have seen, bottom-up change has been very much in the enterprises. I've worked on some of them with bottom-up change, doing really impactful, like decentralized technologies, blockchain solutions. So I've lived that before. At the moment, what I am seeing is even more, it's a bit different type of bottom-up, where what I see mostly, which I'm not embedded in the enterprise at the moment, but from outside, you see almost like 2-3 big hackathons that are being launched at the moment, where there's NHS, there's like all your energy companies, all the healthcare, like all insurance, finance companies. So they are opening up to bottom-up change towards the ideation and solutioning aspect of it. So that's one aspect that I see, which is a part of bottom-up, but it doesn't all have to be. And my gut feeling is that like more can be done within the enterprise as well. Yes, ideations and solutions, finding them with the crowd and startups, but also looking at bottom-up decision-making within the enterprise itself as well, because some of the big enterprises have really huge resources that are like laying around that can be converted to a big USP, big offer, some really useful for their clients. It can be done if you can think of the ecosystem like, yes, outside in, but also inside and outside together, creating together as well. So I see some to sum up, I see some decentralization and bottom up, like with the likes of hackathons. I am not seeing at the moment much what's being done in the enterprise as a systemic change, that you can make this as BAU, but I think this is what should be happening, and I will assume some are more mature than the others in their approach of like looking at their internally their processes, functions, capabilities, and how it can induce bottom-up change.
I guess it's not a surprise that the change we're seeing mostly, or most innovative things we're seeing, is in medium and small sized businesses, because obviously they can move more rapidly and they're less perhaps risk adverse, like we're seeing perhaps the likes of Leon. I think we've touched on sort of pivoting to kind of providing meals for the NHS and so on and so forth. But sorry, Sally, you were going to say.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, isn't that because of a case of like life is a bit more tangible for them, like the ending of their life is much more real, and enterprises, large organizations are much more shielded. If I speak to insurance again, we price for long term, and we have premiums on an annual basis. So whilst new business sales might be hit, that recurring revenue, that impact hasn't necessarily been felt across big organizations. Obviously that's a massive statement, but I think the reason why small businesses are able to react is because they're fighting to survive.
It's that fight or flight kind of thing, isn't it? It's I guess it's fight, flight, or watch and wait to see what happens, right? It's probably the third category, where if you're big enough, you can just sort of sit this out. I guess my point was that perhaps large organizations can learn from what smaller and medium-sized organizations are doing. And the other thing, to the point around ecosystems and emerging technology, Guy, I think for me, there's, I don't know if you've seen this, there's been a big sort of shift towards democratizing, and consumerizing a lot of things. And I'm sure we'll probably move on to talk about things like 3D printers and various other things. But the fact that now the consumer is far more powerful and is able to do far more. I think we were joking about my massive printer behind me before we got on this call. But there has been that trend, hasn't there, towards consumerizing technology. And of course, then in order to kind of use the power of the crowd, you need a effective ecosystem or decentralized organization in order for that to work. Perhaps you can talk a bit more about some of that piece.
I actually have a thought on that, and apart from Oliver bragging about the size of his printer, there is something to be said about the size of an organization, right? And to your point on the ecosystem, right? I think, look, a small company that's a startup where your desk is a cardboard box turned over, right? And everyone shares the one Mac that is powerful enough to do whatever you need it to do. Like, a lot of us have been in those kinds of situations. And you're right, you're one paycheck away from the whole thing going under. And so you are more attuned to what's going on. And you don't have an ecosystem at your disposal, right? In a lot of cases, you are the producer and the stakeholder, and in some cases also the customer, right? And so you don't have what large multi-billion-dollar companies have, which is this insulating set of ecosystems. It's like a web. It's like a fabric, right? And I would not obviously call out any client, but there are some clients, right, that I know of that are looking, at least early on, we're looking at this as like, okay, well, we can weather this. We'll just business as usual, but let's keep an eye on things, and are now at the point of like, oh my God, we got to do something. Let's do something. What can we do? Oh, let's cut all spending. Let's fire a bunch of people, right? And as opposed to, what can we do from a transformational, fundamental business model, right? And so I'll pick on the credit card industry, right? Instead of like what the insurers are doing by sending premiums back in the form of payments back to customers. By the way, I don't know how much loyalty that's going to buy you for your auto insurance company, but whatever. But I think, look at the airlines. Here's a good example, right? For consultants like myself, we rely on status to be able to get where we need to go and get on the right flights. There's a real concern, like, holy cow, I'm not going to make my status this year. The airlines preemptively said, we're going to grandfather all of the status into next year, so you don't worry about that. That's good. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic shift for them to do that, because they make a lot of money off of credit card and points and miles and all of these various things. Other companies, like some credit card companies, aren't rethinking, is there a way that we can suspend payments for a period of time? Can we transform our business model in a way that normally we would never have thought of and that we would be averse to do, but we're going to do it because of the branding, because of we don't know how long this is going to last, and we really do need customers, right? And there's probably some other things in there, but they're shielded from having to make those decisions, I think, by some of these ecosystems that we're talking about that have really good side effects in many places, and in some other places maybe are the cause of some of the lack of nimbleness, I would say.
That's all. Like it really resonates with me. So one of the aspects of the ecosystem, so if you already, like for the companies that have already adopted naturally, because either they have gone through some kind of crisis, like it could be a financial crisis for them, it could be like a PR crisis, like it's what we are experiencing, the crisis situation. Some companies have, like the GE, have induced it for change deliberately, so that there is this sense of urgency to change. So what has happened is, if they have already adopted it before, these companies, and there are examples that I'll give afterwards, these companies, organizations, start to see beyond the industry. So all of a sudden you are not like in the airline business anymore, or hey, I was a retail, well, I'm going into healthcare. So what happened with the ecosystemization of the offering, all of a sudden the industries did blend, because where they were coming from is, what is the job to be done? What are my resources that can be used for some other things? So the industry did blend. So what happened at the moment when, like, let's say travel, like the industry got a cut, but if you were an ecosystem company, you would have like some relation, some value offering, either directly or through your platform, through your technology to healthcare, for example. So what happens is like you're balancing your balance sheet by ecosystemization. So it doesn't mean this is late. Like, you know, like we're talking about, there are companies who are really have this immune system at the moment because they have gone through ecosystemization of their offering of their organization. So they might be like much more resilient, but it doesn't mean it's like really late that if you haven't done it, because it's like the perfect timing. And we were talking about this with Sally, I think, around communities at the moment. Because the crisis has impacted everything, everyone is much more open for people to pivot. Either it's your business model, either it's your offering, your value proposition. They are there to kind of say, yeah, we will test it with you. We will, like, communities are forming, which I'll pass to you. So like we had this conversation around that. So it feels like if you haven't started it, it's a good time to look at it, because we are seeing like the outcomes of the organizations who have done it, and like they are much more resilient at the moment. It's mostly like some of the examples are, it's mostly with the Asian companies. I don't know why. Like there's the Alibaba and like the Anta insurance, and there are the ones like, there is this company which I adore. It was like a white goods company called Hire, where they systemically introduced decentralization and bottom-up innovation, and they went into a globalized mode like very quickly. When it was the times, it was exponential of how they grow afterwards. Because what you're stepping into is like from a centralized control and planning to what you the shift that you do is like more of like a organic way of growing. Yeah.
You're almost using a kind of portfolio analogy, and almost using market forces within your own organization to, to kind of drive what initiatives, happen and don't. So if there's enough interest, enough demand for something, there will be a decentralized kind of effort that coalesces around that idea, and there's almost kind of self-selecting. It's almost the organization's more like an emergent ecosystem, isn't it? Organism. Sorry, than a kind of structure, classical structure where you're told what to do. So it's this kind of upending of the way we've run initiatives. But I mean, I always look to the kind of the open source movement for the very early versions of where this all started. With things like the Linux operating system and the Mozilla browser and various other open source projects where these people didn't know each other. The only thing they had in common was they had an internet connection. Yet they found each other and they collaborated at a massive scale to build software. And I think for me, it's kind of how do you take those sorts of principles and apply them to running your organization, much like folks are looking at agile methodologies now and saying, well, this is good not just for the development teams, but also my marketing campaigns and various other parts of my organization. So kind of tech is kind of leading the way, not just in the kind of gadgets and the software, but also in some of the ways of working. And I think this is an example of that.
Yeah, I think what that is you said that those tech from that early movement, they didn't know each other, but I think they had a common purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that common purpose of what we're seeing in society, people wanting to come together. I personally volunteered with my local council and did someone shopping for them. It's something so small, but the lady was just so grateful, and I can't believe I've never done that before, and I don't really know the people around me either. And it's really struck me that I went further and made some cakes for my neighbours, and I was like, why haven't I done that before? That is ridiculous. And I've got so much energy from that human connection that's really helped me be resilient in these challenging economic times. So how can we bring like the humanity of that into business? And using Gaia's analogy, I love that. I think businesses are in like rigid swim lanes, and how do we create connective tissue where we all like are aligned with that common purpose with the humanity at the heart of it? That sounds super cheesy, but I think business people try to be really serious and really correct all of the time. And actually, if we just think about there's jobs to be done and do the right thing, we can get through it together. But I think that gives a certain vulnerability to organizations that are relied upon for quality, accuracy, timeliness, performance. They're in direct contrast.
This is very timely, right? The 3D printing makerspace, right?
and I think makers in general are some of that common purpose, collaborative, let's build something together. I've got a 3D printer, you have the spool of whatever 3D printing material there is, right? Let's do something. I've got the laser cutter, you've got the soft, whatever it is, right? And there's a lot of that sort of cross pollination of skill set to do something cool. And I think, you know, all apologies to the makerspace community. I think possibly up until recently, right, there's been sort of limited, it's cool to 3D print a little bobblehead figure of yourself, but you know, the practical application in the world,
it's been seen as very nerdy, isn't it? Very nerdy.
I'm generalizing, but you get my
Niche.
trust. They're nerds. They're
like,
nerds. No, yeah, no, but I was just going to say, you know,
Cambridge Makespace at the moment. Like there is this Cambridge Makespace, which I was one of the founders of, like nerdy totally 10 years ago. Now they're like doing face shields for free. Like they assembled together and they are shipping to the needs. So yes, nerdy, but like sometimes very useful. I just want to kind of
and that's exactly where I was going to go, right? I mean, here's this thing where, you know, I know at least on the East Coast of the United States, there's collaboration and there's partnership. There's models and templates and things being shared in the community, so that, you know, I don't have to invent how a mask works or a ventilator. All of these things can be shared and then produced at massive scale, right? On the one side, it's Elon Musk saying he's going to change the gigafactory over to making ventilators, right? That's one thing. On the other side, you have the federal government of the United States invoking laws from World War II to turn auto manufacturers into ventilator companies overnight, right? This is a much more authentic, right, sort of way of and it goes, I think Oliver, you had exactly the right analogy. It's like the early internet, right? We're going to come up with a new protocol called Gopher so that I can go get files and move them around, right? That it didn't exist before. People created this thing because they had a need. And I think you're seeing some of that, exactly like you said, Guy, in the 3D printing space.
Great. I mean, these are fantastic examples of how emerging tech are helping us innovate and be able to push forward in these testing times. And I think, Sally, I mean, your comments around the fact that just having a little bit more of the human element in there is so important. I think I've witnessed the exact same thing down my road, buying things for neighbours and having a group chat with 20 houses that I never knew anybody before. It's fantastic.